Words we hear a lot about, diversity and inclusion, but what does that mean when we're talking about not-for-profit governance? So I'd like to acknowledge that I am on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Kwantlen First Nation. I'm at my home here working remotely today, and that the AMSSA office is on the unceded ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, and we're extremely grateful to be on this land today. So the meeting is obviously on Zoom. We will be recording the meeting so that we can post it later on our website so that folks who weren't able to attend today can see. If you don't want to be seen on the recording, you're absolutely welcome to turn off your video. It's great to see faces, but we understand if you don't want to be on the recording. But whenever we have the chance to see your face, it's definitely great to see you. Today's event is funded by Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada. So IRCC has been a long partner with AMSSA and is very supportive in helping us bring training events like this to the settlement and integration sector in BC. So just a quick overview of the agenda. So we have Allison and Nav from Vantage Point, which is super exciting to have them on board with us today, and we'll introduce them shortly. So as we go through welcome and introductions, we'll be done that soon. We're going to talk about boards and not-for-profit governments. Did I say governments? I meant governance. Why is equity, diversity, and inclusion so important? And what do we mean when we use these words? We throw these words out all the time, equity, diversity, inclusion. But they mean different things to different people. And that's something that we learned at AMSSA when we did our value statements this year. It meant the word equity and the word diversity meant something very different to all of our staff. And so we're going to get into that discussion. And then creating equity. We'll take a quick break, 5 minutes just to stretch, grab coffee. And then we'll come back and talk about the culture of inclusion and steps to support diversity and inclusion. And then wrap up with a Q&A and discussion. So there will be some breakouts. There'll be opportunities to get into smaller groups and have quick chat. But we'll be back and forth between the big group and into some breakout sessions. So Zoom features, I think most people are pretty aware and familiar. There's the raise hand option if you want to get the facilitator's attention. So if you want to ask Allison or Nav a question, raise hand. The chat box is a great way as well, and I'll be monitoring the chat box. And then please remember to mute, unmute, start your video with the icons down the bottom of your screen there. So if you want to put questions in the chat box, like I said, we'll be monitoring that as well. Feel free to make comments or share resources in the chat box. That's always a great place to see. And when we see links popping up in there, always a great place to see those. And if you need any tech support, you can contact Nadine and Javahar at amssa.org. So I recommend you jot this email down because if you're having tech difficulties, you might not be able to access the chat box. So Nadine is the one who's going to be there to support you if you need some support getting back in. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Allison and Nav to introduce themselves and get us going.
Great, thanks, Katie. I'll introduce myself first, and we do have some slides too, Katie, so we'll have to share our screen eventually. But my name's Allison Bruin, and I'm the Executive Director of Vantage Point. I've been at Vantage Point for about 2.5 years now. Before that, I worked as a nonprofit consultant, including doing interim Executive Director work for many different organizations. I also, for 12 years, worked with a women's equality organization called West Coast Leaf as their legal director and their executive director, and worked in mostly women's services my whole life. Worked for the Domestic Workers Association for a while, worked for Eastside Family Place, lots of small nonprofits throughout my career. And I actually was educated to be a lawyer and chose not to practice law. So I still often apply that lawyer lens to some of the things I do, but for the most part, I have been working in nonprofit management all this time. So I do spend a lot of time thinking about governance, so I'll share some thoughts about that with you, and currently serve on the UBC board as the chair of governance there. So get a lot of opportunity to compare giant nonprofits like UBC to teeny little nonprofits like Vantage Point. And it's surprising how much governance is similar and diversity and inclusion issues are similar. So yeah, so I'll pass you over to my colleague, Nav.
Thanks, Allison. My name is Nav Negra. I'm the Communications and Inclusion Manager at Vantage Point. I've been at Vantage Point for just over 3 years now, and it's been great. I've learned a ton, I have to say. My background is mostly actually in the arts. I've worked as an editor of a feminist literary magazine, actually Canada's oldest, called Room Magazine, where we work to lift voices that are usually not heard. I'm also a care consultant in terms of wellness for authors as well, and I don't work for Vantage Point. So I get to work a lot within the world of inclusion and equity, and it's really great to be able to talk to so many different people throughout the different ways that I do approach the work. And yeah, I think actually that's all for me. Thank you.
Great. So I'll start us off by sharing my screen, and we do have a PowerPoint. We'll try to keep an eye on questions and hands up and stuff, but we'll try to pause regularly to invite questions, and there will be time at the end that we've scheduled. So it's surprising how quickly 2 hours can go by. So we'll do our best to try to be clear. So just to start, to let you know what Vantage Point is, because some of you may have heard of us and some of you may not, but we're a nonprofit, a charity as well, and we serve nonprofits, not-for-profit leaders. We convene and connect and equip leaders with educational programming, consulting supports. We provide advocacy for the sector. Most of our learning is in the area of governance and leadership generally, planning people. We actually started out as Volunteer Vancouver, very grounded way back in 1940s, and evolved over the years to focus in on skilled volunteers, in particular board members, and supporting the skilled governance volunteer. So feel free to check out our website. We have lots of free things, downloadable resources. We have a great podcast that Nav is in charge of, blog, newsletters, yeah, all that stuff. So feel free to check in on our stuff. At the end, I'm also going to give you a link because we are part of a group of organizations that include the Victoria and Vancouver Foundation and the City of Vancouver, and doing what's called the No Immunity report that we did when COVID first hit. We did a report in May about the impacts of COVID on the sector. And we've got another survey out there that we'll be sharing with you, that today's actually the deadline. So if you're with organizations and you haven't filled that out yet, hopefully you get a chance. So, oh, I've already talked about me. There's a nice picture of me and there's a nice picture of Nav. Aren't we lovely? We are lovely, really. So that's us. What I wanted to talk about first, just to frame the conversation, is to talk about the not-for-profit sector. You all will have very different probably relationships with the sector, different understandings, different experiences of the language used to apply. I mean, internationally and in the South, we often talk about NGOs, non-governmental organizations. Lots of people in the West talk about voluntary sector or the charitable sector. So just to be clear what we're talking about, there's the public sector is, the government sector. So that includes provincial, federal government, ministries, local government. Then there's the private sector, businesses that are privately owned. They might be publicly traded corporations, but they're designed and structured as corporations. And then there's the not-for-profit sector, and that includes societies that are registered either federally or provincially as a nonprofit organization. About half of those will have charitable status. So charitable status is about a tax status. So you become a charity by applying for and getting charitable tax status, which means you can issue tax receipts, and there's certain kinds of funding that's only available to charities as opposed to not-for-profits. But when we talk about the not-for-profit sector and governance in nonprofits, we are talking about the sector as a whole. So both charitable organizations and not-for-profits that aren't charitable. So so here in BC, there's over 27,000 not-for-profit organizations, and that always sort of surprises people. There's obviously the subsector of the settlement societies and multicultural organizations that are part of AMSSA, or one subsector of what is a very, very large sector in BC. We employ something like 89,000 individuals in the sector, so we're one of the biggest employers as a sector. You know, obviously COVID's having some impacts on that, but and then just to talk about the unique aspect of not-for-profits is that we're governed by usually a volunteer not-for-profit board. And so individuals volunteer. Occasionally some of these positions are paid, but the majority are not. But board members are directors who've agreed to take on the overall governance responsibility for the organization. And again, we're talking about organizations that are quite small to the point they may not have any paid staff at all. And so the board is involved in all kinds of things, operational things with the organization, up to very, very large institutions, like example, UBC is probably the biggest not-for-profit in British Columbia. It is a public institution in the sense that the government appoints a member of the board and has a real interest because they fund it so highly, but it's still an independent not-for-profit. And those organizations, obviously, board members are not at all involved in operational activities, and it's very much a governance board. But the key activities of a board, and I'm telling you this just because I think it's important to understand what the job of the board is when we talk about inclusion and diversity, because there's a high level of responsibility involved in being a board member. The structures around being board members of not-for-profits and charities is a very colonial, a very Western concept, in the sense that it's based on this old-fashioned assumption of the philanthropic individual who has a fair bit of money to donate, who wants to give back to community, who volunteers to play this governance and oversight role for a not-for-profit and has lots of volunteer time, for example. And one of the challenges of when it comes to inclusion and diversity of boards is the high expectation we have of the individuals involved and the high level of responsibility, because it is the job of the board to ensure these 5 things. You know, the board does 2 things. It takes care of itself in terms of ensuring that it has a chair and a treasurer and, you know, some of the key roles that board members need to play. But it also has to take care of the organization. And that means ensuring that the organization is following its mission and its mandate. And the reason that a nonprofit doesn't have to pay tax on any surplus it might have means that someone has to keep an eye on that, make sure that in the public interest, that organization isn't, the funds aren't going to something complicated or wrong, but that those funds are going directly to the mission of the organization. Another role is to ensure the organization has good staff. So you hire an executive director or a CEO or a senior program manager, depending on the size of the organization. And the board has to make sure that person's effective and doing the best for the organization and partner with them in that governance role, because, you know, you hire an ED and they tend to take on a lot of the vision work. You're also there to protect and steward the assets. There's a great governance expert out there, Peter Eccles, who does a lot of work with academic institutions, but he talks about protecting the future of the organization from the present. So the board role is to think in the future and ensure that the organization, you're protecting any assets and thinking, okay, if as an organization, you know, Mosaic has property, for example, Mosaic, who's taking care of that asset and how is that being taken care of to ensure that in the future that asset has value for the organization. Does the organization have sustainable resources? Sometimes with governance, that's interpreted as board members need to donate and be donors to the organization and be actively involved in fundraising. And for many organizations, that's absolutely true, that some engagement of board members involved in fundraising, both personally and in terms of supporting fundraising. But really the actual governance role is to just ensure the organization has the money it needs to do the job that it's trying to do, to make sure it doesn't get in financial trouble, that kind of thing. And so sometimes that means donations and fundraising, sometimes it doesn't. And that is important in the context of diversity and inclusion, because also that can be a barrier in terms of this expectation that somebody might, you know, if you have a very Anglo-Saxon white board and they want to get into diversity and inclusion, they want to be better at that, and they recruit someone from, say, the Chinese Canadian community, that white board may assume that Chinese Canadian person is going to bring this network with them for fundraising purposes somehow, because that's a very traditional idea about what a board's there to do. So it is important in thinking about governance and thinking about inclusion to acknowledge the sort of traditional ideas that might exist about money and funding and where it's all coming from, and that kind of thing. And then the fifth thing is to be the ambassador for the organization. So whether you're officially a spokesperson or whether you're simply there to tell the community and be enthusiastic in the community about this organization. So I just covered those because I think it is important to have some context before we talk about diversity and inclusion, because there's some traditional thinking around governance of nonprofits that I think has gotten in the way of the importance of it. And one approach, and we call it the modes of governing, that comes from a book called Governance as Leadership, and I'm looking up at my bookshelf because it's sitting right up there. It was published by Board Source, which is an American organization that has similar but much more extensive resources like Vantage Point. And it's a great resource for any of you who might be engaging with boards. And they have a lot of really great resources around board diversity and inclusion as well. But anyway, they published this book called Governance as Leadership about 10 years ago. But the modes of governance are really helpful when it comes to diversity to think of as well, because most boards and traditional governance thinking of nonprofits focuses in on the fiduciary role of oversight. So that idea that you're there to ensure that the money is being spent appropriately, you're looking at financials, you're thinking about legal risks, you're considering important policies to put in place to make sure the organization is run well. All of those oversight roles, or those fiduciary roles, which is the legal term for it. But there are two other important roles that a board has. One is to provide insight, and that's where diversity and inclusion becomes very important, because you're there also as an advisor to the organization. You're there to provide your insight from your own professional and lived experience to try to move an organization forward so it makes good decisions as an organization. You're also there to provide strategic thinking and foresight, that big picture, long-term thinking. So those three roles, when they come together, those three modes of governing make for an incredible board. And you know, part of diversity and inclusion, as we know, and I'm just about to pass it over to Nav to talk more about diversity and inclusion. But you know, the key is that a good board is a board that reflects the community that it's serving in some way, and that may be through participants in the organization or alumni, through a social service agency, or people who have been involved in the past are involved in giving back and helping govern the organization through an advisory committee or directly on the board. Sometimes there are client advisory committees, but it also reflects who do you serve. So where you have an organization where, you know, 50% of those served are Indigenous, and there are no Indigenous people on your board, that, you know, reflects a problem in our minds around good governance. So all of this reflects, you know, what constitutes good governance. Yeah, so that's it. So the next piece I'll pass over to Nav, and Nav, just let me know when you want me to go to the next thing.
Perfect. Thank you, Allison. Yeah, so embracing diversity, I really want to emphasize that it is a journey, and this is a journey that we come to when we are starting to embrace diversity, inclusion, and equity, and frankly, decolonizing as well in our organizations. And we want to be honest with ourselves with where we are starting, and that we are, like I've put here, we are going to make mistakes, and that's okay. It's never gonna be a one and done situation where you have a list of maybe a list of check boxes that you're just going to check off as you go along. That's not going to be the case here. And so that's why we're going to be forgiving with ourselves when we do make mistakes, because it is an ongoing process. Through embracing diversity, natural turnover creates opportunities to enhance diversity. And this gives you a great time to reflect on your board or within your organization. You know, are you, you know, does your community appear in your organization? Does your board reflect the community you are serving? Does it reflect the goals of, you know, diversity inclusion, where you are in your journey, and how can you, you know, change your practices or change your approach to make sure that this opportunity of turnover is going to help enhance the diversity and inclusion within your organization and board. Allison, I'll get you to switch the slide. Thank you. And we also want to talk briefly about safety as well. When you are going into this work, you want to consider the types of safety that people are considering and paying attention to often subconsciously when they are going into the space or within your organization or within your board. The first one is physical safety. This is, this one's very much what we all are very hyper aware of sometimes, where it refers to the protection from physical harm such as violence or hazardous materials within maybe the building that you're in, maybe the room, maybe the people that you're with. So this physical safety is something that we are aware of all the time. And so it's something that, we want to protect others from and be aware of when we are inviting them into spaces and things. Social safety refers to the ability to show candor and vulnerability in discussions without fear of personal repercussions, shame, judgment, or rejection. So can I say what I'm thinking without worrying that it's going to come back at me? Can I maybe state my opinion without worrying that maybe it'll cost me my next position or an opportunity to work on a fundraising project with the board? I'm going to be assessing that social safety throughout any sort of interactions that I have with the board and organization, and that'll make it so that I'm able to, voice my opinion or state my what I'm thinking and things like that as well. So social safety is something I think that you can often tell with someone how they're feeling with that. It comes off in their body language and things like that. And if you see that, it gives you an opportunity to think about how you can make it more of a safer space. And I want to also pause and say, just by saying this is a safe space does not make it so. It's about building that safe space as well. So psychological safety is a lot like social safety as well, where it refers to a sense of balance, health, and personal well-being within an individual being in that space, being on that board or within that organization. They feel psychologically safe, so they're able to just be themselves. And then cultural safety refers to the recognition, respect, and nurture of an individual's cultural identity. For example, for me, I know that I can go to Vantage Point and say that I'm going to be celebrating Diwali, and nothing, it'll be celebrated along with me. There will be no repercussions and things like that. And you want to be aware of that. You want to celebrate wherever someone's coming from, whatever sort of cultural identity they come from, and not really make it so that they can't represent themselves truly. And by doing that, that builds that safe space by offering the space for them to just truly be themselves and to speak what they need to without repercussions or fear of repercussions. And Alison, if you could move on, thank you. So here's some definitions. These are the ones that we're going to be using today, and you'll often come across a lot as you go through this work and grow your organization and board in diversity and inclusion practices. But for diversity, it's the condition of having or being composed of differing elements, variety, an instance of being composed of different elements or qualities. So with diversity, how I see it is, it's a diversity of perspectives, of individuals, of intersections. And when I say intersections, it means that someone might be coming from a different cultural background and they might have a different gender than you, or they might have a different experience than you. So bringing in those diverse lenses as well. Inclusion, authentically bringing traditionally excluded individuals and or groups into processes, activities, and decision and policy making in a way that shares power. And for me, inclusion also just means including folks. So including those who are within your community, including those who are keen on your board or what your organization's mission is, and making sure that you do have an inclusion of perspectives that come from that diversity element as well. And that it's not just, it's not sort of a hold in idea of what inclusion and diversity is. It's ever expanding. It's tons of perspectives. And then privilege. We're going to talk about privilege a little bit later, but it's basically, I say it's an advantage or immunity granted or available only to a particular person or group of people. And it varies between all of us. We all have different levels of privilege. And like I said, we will be talking about this more, but it's not going to be the same for everybody, but being aware of your own can make all the difference. All right, thank you, Alison. Move on to the next one.
Yeah, before we move, I just wanted to comment on diversity, the language of diversity. And I think groups are increasingly moving a bit away from that language, just because diversity can be simplified to a point of not really contributing to the kind of diversity we're talking about here, which is equity and inclusion. That diversity sometimes can end up being, well, as long as, you know, on a board, for example, well, we need to make sure we have enough lawyers, or we need to make sure we have enough accountants, things like that. And so it can get very simplified down to really what we're not talking about here, which is why people use language like equity and inclusion as well. And sometimes when we talk about the concept of EDI, or equity, diversity, and inclusion, some are now saying that the D is actually about decolonizing, not specifically diversity. So anyway, I just thought I'd comment on that. And yes, Dawn asked if we'd have access to the slides, and we will. So we'll send them out to you after. Yeah, so next on the agenda, I'll pass back to you now.
Thank you. So yeah, so we're going to talk about also the benefits of inclusion. When you approach inclusion in your work, it's about, like I said, it's about including others. It's about including those perspectives, and really about reflecting your community as well as a board or organization. So inclusive boards, it's been shown that they actually make better decisions because there's other perspectives coming onto those projects or those problems. And so making better decisions becomes possible because of all those varying perspectives. They come with individuals come with different lived experience or learned experience, and that can make all the difference when trying to come to that final decision or solved problem. Providing better service is also possible, and that comes back to the being able to reflect your community on your board and within your organization. By understanding your community through that lived and learned experience, mostly lived actually, but lived and learned experience, you are able to provide better service because there is that element of understanding there as well. And that comes from inclusion. More attractive to potential employees and volunteers. I cannot stress this enough. If someone's interested in your organization, they will go to your people page and look at who's on your board and look at who's on your within your organization as staff or volunteers. They are going to try to see if they see themselves there, or if they see that they see others who are maybe come from. For me, it would be maybe I want to see that there's more Black, Indigenous, or people of color within the staff, so then I know that there's more potential for my safety within that organization. So they are looking, and then the more inclusion and diversity that you do have, and the more that it shows on, you know, outwardly, that's going to make you more attractive to potential board members, employees, and the such. It also makes inclusion and having different perspectives on your board and an organization makes you more creative and innovative. It comes back to that lived and learned experience and different differing experiences that do come and perspectives that do come. It makes it so that someone else can maybe have had a different community, and within that community they do things so differently that you've ever considered. It comes back to what Allison was saying about boards having this sort of traditional governance that they expect to have happen with every board, no matter if they're big or small. But perhaps this other person who's come onto your board has actually done governance totally different because of their small organization that actually supports this very, very small community in a different city. They can come and bring that innovative, creative thought process to your board, creating different opportunities. And then new partnerships, because often with someone new, when in the inclusion process, they have a new community, they have a new network, and often there'll be folks that maybe you haven't been able to gain access through with your current work through maybe the last fundraiser you did or the last initiative that you tried to put forward. It'll bring forward new partnerships and thus put your work much further than it maybe has ever reached before. All right, thank you, Allison. We'll move to the next slide. And so why embrace EDI? Why embrace equity, diversity, and inclusion? I always say to embrace it, it's one of those things where to embrace equity, diversity, and inclusion, it benefits the organization, and it also represents the realities of demographics. Canada in itself is actually it is a very diverse country. It has different diversities, including gender diversity, cultural diversity, and the like. And often our communities are actually growing in that diversity as well. So by embracing this work, you really are reflecting the community that you are serving, and you want to be aware of that as you move through this process. The legal and moral obligations, for me, I always shy away from saying that this is why you should be doing this work. It's a good thing to note that, you know, the Human Rights Code and the Constitution of Canada does give you, you know, legal and moral reasons. But I think in order to really get into this work and really embrace it and do it well within your board or organization, you kind of want to leave that aside. And I'd say when you are approaching this work, but know that it is there in terms of the reason why to embrace it. And then we're going to be moving into a breakout room shortly here. So we're going to be putting you in, oops. We're going to be putting you in breakout rooms of about 4 to 5 people. And I'd like you to discuss what are some challenges that you've had in attempting to diversify your board and really dive into that. So what have you tried, and what hasn't worked for you, what has, and what are the differences that you have happened there? So what are some challenges for sure that you've had? And we're going to be getting those rooms started pretty shortly here. Welcome back. Thanks everyone for getting into those groups and discussing. And while we're just waiting for more people to return, I'd love to hear some challenges that were discussed in the groups. You feel free to share on the chat, or unmute yourself and just let me know. But I'd love to hear, what challenges have you had attempting to diversify your board or your organization? I mean, I know we're all shy, but anybody? Unless, there actually haven't been any challenges, which I would be surprised by, but great. Yeah, Louisa, I see a hand there. You can go ahead and unmute yourself. Actually, Louisa, I can't quite hear you.
I can go. I've been a board member of Richmond Family Place for 11 years and lived in Richmond since 1973. And to be very, very honest, back then, I have to say, Asians were truly a visible minority. I think there was Japanese. I think there were only 2 Chinese students in my high school. The rest were Japanese and white. Now it's almost the other way around, where, I have to say this, I have Caucasian friends. I have a feeling they're feeling that they're the visible minority in Richmond as opposed to the other way around. So I look at it from the board perspective. We had a pretty good diverse group, but as the years went by, we found we had more Asians, just that people retired, people left and moved on. And we didn't have too many males. We now, I think, proud to say we have 8 members. We have 1 male, and he's actually, I can't remember where he's from. He's either from Pakistan or India, so we're excited about that. We have a lady from Iran, and well, we don't have anybody, who's Indigenous. It's not for the lack of trying. It's just, hard enough getting people to volunteer as board of directors. So I don't think we are deliberately looking for diversity. I mean, if people apply and they qualify, we'll just gladly embrace them. But it really, really worked out this year that, we got a lot more diversified than we ever have been. So I kind of, am pleased with that. It wasn't a strategic part of us, but maybe it just worked out well. It's going to serve us well going forward. So I'm excited about that.
That's great. And it does sound like with this new diversifying that you have experienced this year, that maybe this reach potential can actually grow, and perhaps those who you're keen to have on your board who you haven't been able to quite get yet, that can actually be possible going forward. And as you continue this work and maybe even try new things and speaking to different community members, that can also help as well. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, and I think it's also, when we're thinking about these things, it's partly why sticking to the diversity alone as a concept isn't always as helpful, because what's important also obviously are the relationships that the organization has. And that's especially true if we're hoping to, build our interaction and our support of the Indigenous community as a social service agency. It's about the relationship. So it's not necessarily, oh, we have one Indigenous person on our board. It's more about the organization as a whole. Is it inclusive? Is it welcoming to Indigenous people? Is that a community in your neighborhood you need to serve? I mean, it depends so much on the organization, right? And what work you're doing and who you're serving. And an organization in Richmond right now is largely going to be serving Asian Canadians. And so that would make sense that the board of a Richmond organization would be dominated by Asian Canadians. Like, that makes sense because that's the community you're in, that's the community you're serving. So it's not like it's a requirement. It's also hard when we are talking about volunteers again. it's about engagement, and that's, I guess, what I mean by relationships. It's, you know, you're gonna be able to get people, and it's gonna be easier to get people to join your board if people are engaged in a variety of ways in your organization. So are there opportunities to join a committee and help out without having to be on the board necessarily? And if that's the case, then, you know, you slowly kind of bring them in the circles of engagement as people get closer. So yeah, it's looking at the whole organization. What kind of relationships do we have? You know, who appreciates the work we're doing? Who wants to get more deeply involved? And how can we as a group be a welcoming organization to those who live in the neighborhood and are part of the mission that we're trying to serve? So, you know, like I had somebody say to me, she was a European Canadian who was on a board of a South Asian arts organization. And she said, well, that board wasn't diverse at all. And the funders, you know, didn't seem to give them a hard time. So why are they giving this other group a hard time? It's like, well, that was a South Asian arts organization. So of course the majority of the board is South Asian. Like, you know, the idea that they have to be diverse, you know, just isn't logical, right? So it's sort of thinking those things through, I think, around what's realistic for our organization. So yeah. I'm just looking at some of the chat room sharing too, but yeah, I mean, partly one person saying they haven't struggled with the diversity because we don't really talk about it. So it's not a challenge. It's like, well, that's a good way not to make it a challenge. So the question is it an issue to be addressed that just isn't being addressed? Or is it true that maybe you don't need to talk about it because you already have that level of involvement? We have probably room for one more comment if anyone else wants to share a thought.
Yeah, and absolutely, Katie. Unseen diversity, disabilities, LGBTQ plus individuals. This is where actually my point was also going to be, you don't, like, it comes back to that checkbox thing as well. Like what Allison was saying is you don't want to just say that you need to have these individuals on your board. It's who you're serving and who, you know, it's the nature of the inclusion that you're bringing to your organization too. So if someone with an unseen disability, do they, when we're going to go through this a little bit more, but do they know what your organization is about in terms of what building are you operating out of? What's sort of the structure of your organization that they need to be aware of? Any languages that they need to maybe know, maybe they have a language barrier that they need to be aware of as well, that you would need to be aware of as well, which we'll talk about later too. LGBTQ plus, do they feel safe? And that comes back to the safety element too, to approach your organization, maybe as a volunteer in the hopes of becoming a board member as well. So there's, you know, that's where I want to move away from sort of, I call it the tokenizing part of it all. When you are looking at your board and you're thinking, okay, well, we just need X to kind of round out our diversity quota. You don't want to be doing that. You want to think about who you're serving, what your mission is, and who you would like to see on your board genuinely, not because someone told you that needs to happen, but genuinely, this is what you would like to see, and building that safety as well. Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Dennis, you had unmuted yourself. Did you want to say something?
No, I wanted to just touch on my comment that I posted on the chat, and you said, is it not an issue because it's not being discussed? Whether in comparison to, is it just something we're not really seeing as an issue? And I think, at least for my workplace, and in our breakout room, I discussed how, I mean, I think it's naturally molded that we're a very inclusive and diverse group of individuals in our workplace. And, you know, I'm very proud of that. And I think it's naturally molded into that. Like, I mean, and I also pose that, you know, diversity comes in many different forms, right? It's not just for ethnic, for example, ethnic diversity. You know, we have multiple members that would identify with LGBTQ plus groups, and people from different ethnic cultural backgrounds, speak multiple different languages, have different levels of education that's diverse, right? Different people studying different things. I think that's diversity in itself that will bring, you know, further benefits to your board and to your organization. So I just wanted to say that, like, I don't think it's an issue that we neglected. I just think
Right.
we're very fortunate that that's the place that we're in, where I'm working.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I would also say that maybe thinking about, and maybe it's after this discussion today, but maybe what's the next step for your organization, since you guys are so comfortable just having sort of this be a thing that's ingrained within your organization? What could you be doing next as well to continue this journey?
Yeah, and it all intersects with governance in the sense of, it's a good practice at a board level to have annual, some kind of self-assessment or just kind of check in with the board to say, does everyone on the board feel comfortable speaking up at board meetings, for example? Like, there's ways you can do that. You can do it anonymously with a little survey, or you can have a conversation or whatever, but just to say, it's great, just as good practice for the board, regardless of whether it's about inclusion and diversity. Do people understand what their role is as a board member? Are people feeling good about their experience? And that sometimes will uncover some experiences that people might be having that they hadn't really realized they were having about, no, I don't talk up very much in board meetings. Why is that? Oh, I guess I'm not that comfortable with it, or I'm not sure I have anything to contribute, for example. Like, so it's good to combine these with other kinds of good practices around checking in with people to make sure everyone's still feeling that way. It's kind of a good segue into the conversation around, like, we're gonna go through some of the principles, like some of the deeper thinking around all of this that we need to consider when we're approaching this conversation. And none of it's particularly simple, but I know a lot of you are very experienced in this area, and so everyone's coming from different places. But the next thing we wanted to talk a bit about was the concept of privilege and some of the other kind of equity principles that impact how these conversations can happen. So I'll just share my screen again. Oops, I'm on the wrong slide. Let me quickly go back here. So I think when we talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion, we do need to think about the concept of privilege, because diversity doesn't necessarily uncover that concept, because it is about kind of, do we have diverse experiences at the table? Do we have diverse knowledge sets and professional skills, along with other kinds of differences that we might carry? And, the important thing I think to understand is that equity isn't about treating everybody necessarily the same way. Actually, that's fairness. Equity is actually about providing people with some extra support in order to be able to participate fully like someone who has privilege. So this cartoon, a friend of mine, Rob Cottingham, did it, and it struck me as one of the clearest descriptions of how privilege works. And the way privilege works is that who we are as a person depends on all kinds of things: where we were born, when we were born, who we were born to, the state of our family, the physical health of our family when we were born. All kinds of things come to play in terms of who we are as a person. Our experience of violence, our experience of family safety, our experience of state and government safety, where we are and how we live our life, whether we're straight or not, or queer, or whatever our thing is. But that where we might want to be in our life, people who have privilege, that leap is much smaller. So the example I give is myself as a leader in the not-for-profit world. I was born in Canada. I'm 6th generation Anglo-Saxon Canadian. My family's been involved in politics in Canada since the nation was created, and even before that. And so it's not that surprising that I ended up in a leadership role. The fact that it's in the nonprofit world as opposed to maybe politics or business is, partly some choices I made that I might have made differently. But the reality is, because I was born with so much privilege in the context of Canada and how it works, it was easier for me to have some of the things we might describe as external success. Whereas someone who maybe was born in the same family as me, but was born with a disability, for example, it would make it there are more challenges that person has to face in order to achieve the same level perhaps of success. And of course, there are things that come in our way that may make that different. It doesn't mean that, I think what happens with privilege is that people often will say, well, I worked really hard for what I got. And I would not want to suggest for a second that I haven't worked hard at various things in my life. That's not the point here. The point is that I didn't have to work nearly as hard as someone who may be a new Canadian who was a lawyer in their home country, came to Canada, had to struggle to get a law degree even, or any kind of recognition in terms of that education, and have that recognized even in the not-for-profit sector in terms of getting an executive director job. My law degree that I got here in British Columbia has helped me get jobs in leadership in the not-for-profit sector. I no question. It doesn't mean I didn't work hard when I was at law school. I worked hard sometimes, but because of my privilege, I got through. So anyway, so that is just a really important concept that we need to remember when we're talking about it's about not making assumptions about where people are coming from. It's about checking our own sense of what things have made our lives successful. So a new immigrant from India could come from a very upper class family in India and have wealth and support behind them of that kind and have high level of education. And another person, same immigrant, came same times, even same age, same gender even, who may have come from a different community in India and have less financial resilience in terms of their experience here as a new immigrant. So all of those things can contribute to the person who has the privilege often doesn't see it, right? They don't know that someone else's leap is bigger. All they know is they leapt. So yeah, so I think I'll leave it there in terms of privilege and that concept. And this is the concept that we were talking about around the difference between equity and equality, or the idea of fairness. I mean, the fairness of inputs and the equality and equity of outcomes is what we're really talking about when we talk about EDI. So fairness would be, let's give everyone a bicycle. It's exactly the same size bicycle. It's exactly the same kind of bicycle. There's no difference. Well, that seems fair. So if someone in a wheelchair chooses not to use the bicycle, that's their problem. Well, we all know that's not true. That, you know, a person in a wheelchair needs a different kind of bicycle if they're going to be out cycling with everyone. And so that bicycle might cost more than the bicycle that we gave to the little kid who's going to grow out of their bike. So we gave them a, you know, cheaper bike because soon they're going to need a bigger bike. So blah, blah, blah. You know, the bicycles might all cost a different amount, or they might be a different kind. They might involve different things. Maybe a person can't participate on a bicycle at all and needs something different in order to participate. So those concepts are just, as you move through and you think about equity and inclusion at the board level and at the governance level, this plays out in terms of what people need in order to participate fully. So a young woman with small children, chances are she's the one who's doing most of the domestic care work at home. It's going to be harder for her to participate in a meeting around dinner time every day, because there's a good chance she probably has to go and do, so she may not be able to participate. So she may just not volunteer for your board. So if you want young women to be involved in your board, maybe you need to think about moving your meeting times to Saturday mornings when that person has a spouse who's home, or a mom that can watch the kids for a few hours for the board meeting, that kind of thing. So, and this is about acknowledging that, you know, equity is about acknowledging our differences. It's about being free and having that cultural safety that Nav talked about, to actually talk about our own experiences and what the reality is for us and why we might need something a bit different in order to be able to participate fully in what it is being offered. So yeah, so I mean, the big questions that we need to think about is, what does it take to enable people from different backgrounds, different circumstances to join the board? And what does it take so that all board members can participate meaningfully? And that's about different communication skills. You know, if a board only produces all of their documentation in English, but you actually want a number of new Canadians to be involved in your board, then do you need to do a bit of translation, or do you need to, you know, have an interpreter at board meetings in order to make sure that everyone's following the conversation? Or is there other ways you can offer support to somebody? I know for, and I'm not going to in any way speak as an expert in any way, shape, or form about Indigenous experiences, but one of the realities for Indigenous communities is they'll look at an organization and say, does that organization show any signs that it understands my culture and my experience? And one way it will show that is if you're inviting, there's more than one Indigenous person involved in the organization. So how does it show up, right? How do we see ourselves in the organization? Do we bank at Van City because when I walked into their branch, they had a picture of a queer person on their wall. And I thought, oh, they must understand what it means to be queer, so it's okay. They'll be nice to me. They won't be mean to me when they find out that I'm gay. Right? Like that's the kind of thinking that we have to consider, is that people have all kinds of different backgrounds and we need to ask them outright whether they have any barrier to participation. So I think we're hit the right time frame. Yeah, perfect. Good on us. So we'll just stop there and take a 5-minute break. So if people want to come back at 3:06, we'll jump right back in, but it's good just to turn your screens off and take a breather.
Okay, so welcome back, everyone. We're going to move into creating a culture of inclusion, and we're going to talk a bit about biases as well that can play into when you are doing this work, how you are approaching it, and what sort of plays unconsciously as you are, maybe recruiting or thinking about who you need on your board or where your gaps are, and even how you consider barriers and how to approach them. So one activity that we've actually done a couple times on this with this presentation is to consider looking at these 3 individuals. Who would you say, just by looking at them, is a scientist, a ballet dancer, or an activist? And if anybody does have a gander, you can definitely let me know in the chat. I'll see if I can pull it up here. But we usually, and if you think shout it out. Feel free to unmute yourself. But I would be curious if you think you could know just by looking. Just give a few minutes here because we're not going to totally dive into this.
Maybe everyone's nervous to say in case they're wrong.
And that's actually kind of the point here. It's that we don't know.
It's never good to assume, says somebody. Yeah.
Exactly. And we all know the saying that comes with assuming.
Yeah.
But what happens here is it does play into what actually, for an example, when I did this last time, we had a much smaller group. And what I did was I actually did ask outright to the group, who was who? And a lot of people, what they did, what they reflected back and said, okay, for me, I'm going to say, so my unconscious bias might be telling me that a ballet dancer needs to be female. So I'm actually going to pick C as the ballet dancer. And so a lot of the participants ended up doing that with this example, was they checked in with their unconscious bias, or what they now knew as their biases, and actually played against them in order to give me the answers they thought I was looking for. Funnily enough, they did do the correct answers. A lot of them did get it correct. And I'll just share with you here what they are. So we have the scientist, who is actually B. Her name is Harry Bimariju. She's 12 and she participated in the White House Science Fair exhibition, where she presented for her technological innovation. And then for the ballet dancer, it was C, as a lot of people did guess, because again, they were going against their bias and they wanted to guess who they thought I would want them to guess, is how they phrased it. So it was C. So it's dancer Jet Owen Hughes, who is a grade 4 student from Waterloo, Ontario.
And Diana got it right, because she said that looks like a professional headshot. So that has to be enough, yeah.
And I love that too. So there are hints, but often, yeah.
Well, and that's part of it, right? Is what's the clue? What are the clues that we attach to how people look or how they present?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And then A is our activist here, who is a 12-year-old transgender student activist, Anthony James from Saskatchewan, who posts to YouTube to voice his opinions about trans identities. But again, like what Alison's saying, we're looking for clues and we're looking to go against what we initially knee-jerk think we should be doing or thinking. And that again, so that plays into the unconscious and conscious biases that we do have. So I will say that we all have these biases. And it's when we when we move into this work, it's that we want to approach them. We want to see them. We don't want to shy away from them or be ashamed of them. So I would say, if you know you have an unconscious bias, say that, for example, you think all dancers are female, for example, go to that bias and think about what that is and why that's there, and then challenge it for yourself. So a conscious bias is associations that people knowingly hold. So for example, for me, it could be a conscious bias that rock and roll music is the best. I'll use that example. And we know that, but I would still want to challenge that and think to myself, why is that a bias that I hold? And they're not always negative biases either. So you just want to be present with them and understand how they are affecting what the problem is that you're trying to solve, or the person that you're trying to work with, what's happening there. Unconscious bias is associations that people unknowingly hold, and they're expressed automatically without conscious awareness. So that's kind of what I talked about earlier with that example. It's that unconscious bias where you're like, hang on, maybe that female dancer is not actually the right bias, not actually the right answer. I'm going to go against that and go with maybe another example or another thought. And that's where, with Allison said, where you're looking for clues and keys and thinking about how, so you've not acknowledged that bias and now you're playing against it. So how can you look and take those clues and maybe form a different opinion or a different understanding of the situation?
And I shared on the chat line the Harvard test that you can do on your own to try to help you identify any implicit bias that you might be carrying around or you might have, because it is the beginning of the journey in terms of recognizing where you already make assumptions about people based on all kinds of things.
Absolutely.
So it's a nice look at what, it turned out when I did it that I actually assume most the doctors are women, which is this unusual unconscious bias, but my experience has been my doctors have almost always been women. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I would welcome everyone to do that test when you do have some time, and because that will help you take on those biases and play with them a bit. See what's going on there. For Allison, yeah, it's because you've always had a female doctor. So that's something that is playing with in your mind, whether you know it or not. So absolutely. So creating a culture of inclusion. A culture of inclusion is one within which people feel safe to be themselves and contribute meaningfully. And I cannot stress that enough. It's when you're ready, you come into a space and you're just ready to truly be yourself and contribute wholly with that group or that board or that organization. So this looks like acknowledging accessibility needs. So if I have an accessibility need and I'm going into a space, I know that I'll be safely able to go into that space, and it'll be, maybe it'll have a button I need to push that door open, or maybe it'll have a translation so that I can follow along at the same pace as everybody else, and I can see everybody. Maybe it'll have an interpreter ready for me so that I can move into the work easily. Addressing people in the way they prefer. This is something with pronouns. I know a lot of people are still getting used to pronouns. So my pronouns are she, her. I have a friend whose pronouns are they, them, and they actually did have a board member who refused to use their pronouns. And so that made it so that they didn't feel safe to contribute meaningfully or go into that space because their pronoun was rejected by that board member. And even though they had discussions, it still was rejected, and they subsequently ended up leaving that organization. So addressing people in the way they prefer is truly meaningful and does create that culture of inclusion so they can feel safe and contribute meaningfully. And then removing language barriers. We have, I think AMSSA especially would be dealing with this a lot with newcomers coming from such a variety of backgrounds, cultures, and languages. So having it where you can ask the person, what language are you most comfortable with? And then work to maybe provide a translation of your materials for that person. Maybe it's having a translator in the room, or maybe it's providing that individual with sort of a draft of what's going to be happening so they can work with a mentor or someone else on the board or organization to kind of work with the materials that they'll be addressing later.
Give an example, like one of the things about addressing people the way they prefer, a lot of newcomers to Canada are told, anglicize your name so that it's easier for people to pronounce. you know, it's obviously individuals' choice as to whether they want to do that or not, or they feel more comfortable with a sort of Canadianized, and I do air quotes, name version of a name. But at the same time, you know, a culture of inclusion, there would be efforts made to properly pronounce people's names, and people would ask outright, you know, help me, you know, pronounce your name. I'm not familiar with it. You know, an example the other day when someone, her name was Mandeep and it was spelled D-I-P, and I wasn't sure if that meant her name was Mandip or Mandeep. So I asked her in the chat room, is it pronounced Mandeep? And she said, no, it's Mandeep, it's just spelled differently. But that kind of, you know, acknowledging differences in the room is part of what we're talking about here.
Mm-hmm. And I would also say on that note too, always ask, like Allison did, to say, I'm just say, in order to not mispronounce your name, how do you pronounce it? I think it's better to try to actually ask the person how they would like to, how their name is either pronounced or how they would like to be addressed, as opposed to assuming and kind of tripping over their name. My full name is Navneet, which I don't use very often. I actually prefer to be called Nav. But people do often ask, is it like, you know, is it Nav or Nav? And I'm happy to let them know what it is and how I prefer to be addressed. Creating space for cultural holidays or practices, just having an awareness of what is kind of on the radar in terms of cultural holidays or practices is something that your organization can do. They can create sort of a calendar of space for folks to put in their cultural holidays or practices, and they can just put it in the calendar and everybody can be aware of what's happening with that individual or the individuals on the board or within the organization. But having an acknowledgement that all cultures come with their varying degrees of holidays or practices and making space for them, acknowledging them, giving time off or things, or giving way. So for example, if someone needs to go to a Diwali celebration, letting them celebrate that or take that time to go and celebrate and acknowledging their culture. That can do a lot for creating that inclusion, safety within the organization or board. And then seating arrangements that communicate equality. This varies so much with different cultures. I know that for, I think, traditional North American nonprofits, you know, it might be sort of the board table or the sort of square that we tend to do when we are in a board meeting. Maybe it's actually a U shape that would be something that you could do that communicates equality. We could talk with everybody on your board to say, okay, so if we are seated like this, how does everybody feel? Can we all see each other? Do we all feel that we are equal here and that this is creating a space of equality? Is someone using a wheelchair that they maybe need to come into the room where there isn't a table in front of them, but maybe they need a bit more space around them and things like that as well. So what can we do to kind of create that equality just by being seated and arranged differently as well? So it's not that traditional boardroom style, maybe it's something completely different.
And if I could just comment on the chat, the point that, you know, in multicultural environments, if people are speaking in a language that not everyone in the room understands, is that excluding people? And in some circumstances that does exclude people, especially if it's about business issues and you're having a conversation about something important that everyone in the room needs to be a part of that decision. But I think just the fact of speaking another language in front of other people doesn't necessarily mean that you're being exclusive. It may be that you're exchanging personal details about a common friend. Why should you speak in my language if it has nothing to do with me? I also tend to be, as a unilingual person, more embarrassed by my lack of capacity to speak other languages than I am hurt by the fact that other people. I mean, I worked for an organization, the Domestic Workers Association. The majority of people involved were Filipino and spoke Tagalog, and there were lots of times when it was totally appropriate for them to be having conversations in Tagalog, and other times when it's like, okay, everyone, we have to speak English now because the Anglophones in the room need to be able to participate. So again, it's discussion, right? It's being thoughtful about who's in the room and what the goal is that you're trying to accomplish. And if you're trying to accomplish full inclusion in that moment, then you need to speak a language that is common or have interpreters in the room.
And I would say too, it's acknowledging that folks do speak different languages. So if there are maybe say 7 languages on your board and just acknowledging that those are all spoken. And if someone, for example, actually I have a coworker and we speak the same language, often we'll kind of tell each other jokes and things like that in our language. And then what I'll do immediately is I'll actually translate that joke for my coworker who's sitting right next to us and say, oh my goodness, this is hilarious, you need to hear this. And then I'll translate it for them. So there is also that sort of inclusion of saying, I understand that you don't speak my language, but I'm going to fill you in if appropriate too.
Well, I often say to someone after some intense conversation in English, if I know that's not their first language, you know, were you able to follow that? Can we stop for a minute and just make sure everyone's, you know, on the same page here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It's always good to stop and pause. And I think regardless, just make sure everybody is on that same page and say, are we good to continue? Is there any gaps I can fill in and things like that as well? Continuing on creating a culture of inclusion, the inclusion of Indigenous members, which I think I hear from a lot of the discussion that's already happened, is something that a lot of you are keen to start to develop within your organization on your board. A few things that you can consider while you are doing this work is thinking about what different cultural elements there are within Indigenous communities that maybe are differing from what you're used to on your board or organization. I always say that this is actually some of these are very similar to what I experience in my culture of being a Punjabi person. So a different understanding of time. So structuring the time of meetings to allow for stories to be told. In Indigenous communities, often storytelling is so crucial to the way that things are communicated and addressed and sort of marinated in, that we want to be able to create space for these stories to be told. So that's, you know, maybe not having such a strict agenda, for example, or maybe making space for storytelling. So saying that, you know, we'll do introductions, then maybe we'll leave time for storytelling, then next. So it's kind of, instead of saying 3 o'clock we'll start here, 3:15 we'll go here, it's saying these are the things that we will cover, but we're making space for this type of storytelling to be told. A different history, this is huge. Acknowledging the acknowledgement of traditional territories, but also the histories of these territories. What did these different communities experience and what truly did happen on these territories and on these lands? And what kind of potential experiences is that bringing with this person to your board? What barriers could this be creating for this individual? And so much more within that history. And so with that acknowledgement and understanding and educating of yourself, that can really go miles in creating that culture of inclusion. And then different interpersonal priorities. So Indigenous communities, and I would say again, Punjabi communities, we tend to emphasize relationship between members and people and staff and board members way more than we do with maybe getting things done. So I would rather have a strong relationship with everyone on my board first before I'm going to dive in and maybe start a fundraising campaign. So it's really giving space for those relationships to build. That could be something like having an icebreaker every meeting to say, what was something fun that happened this weekend for you? Or if you had a favorite movie, what would it be? So something like that, where you're building those sort of relationships and friendliness, so that again, that comes back to the whole building safety, but it also comes with making space for someone and how their community and culture approaches this kind of work. And actually next we're going to go into a breakout. And Allison, I think you're going to lead this one.
Actually, I'm not sure we have the time for it now.
Oh, okay, fair enough.
I think we should probably just move to the next thing. We can pause here, pause for a second and just talk about just a few of these concepts before we move on to the next thing, because I think we can all learn a great deal when we open ourselves up to the traditional learning and thinking of our Indigenous nations that have been here for so many centuries. And that concept of different history and acknowledging different history is so important. I mean, even Louise earlier mentioned the fact that there was a time when, the Japanese Canadians were the biggest population outside of Europeans in the Richmond area. Well, how come they're not anymore? That's a really important part of Canadian history, right? And acknowledging some of those differences and how our communities have changed over time. And that, so that the acknowledgement of traditional territories, it's become a very common practice, but its meaning is to say there's a history here that we all just want to pay attention to and remember, and that we're all coming to this moment from different places. And I think that's the biggest part of inclusion is making sure that we're acknowledging that our histories are not all the same, and we are coming from some different experiences. So yeah. And so I'll just actually, do you want to go to the next slide now, or do you maybe?
Oh yeah, no, I've got it. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So yeah, the next thing we wanted to just talk a bit about was some of the practical kind of tips or tools for how to build more equity and diversity and inclusion and decolonization in your board. And of course, it can start anywhere. It's probably already begun. You may be far along the path. But the fact is, it is a journey, and there's never any one moment where you can stop and say, yeah, we've totally got this whole EDI thing figured out. You know, some organizations can look around and, as you know, Dennis described, and be very proud of where they're at when it comes to this kind of inclusion and equity. But it has to start somewhere. So it has to begin by thinking about it, by having at least one champion on the board who feels strongly about it and kind of keeps it in the sights of the rest of the organization. And if that's you, or that's you in conjunction with somebody else on your board, if your executive director might be that person who's kind of pushing that agenda, or the concepts and wanting really to explore that. But the practice, it can start with how your board functions. So looking at how do we have our meetings, and the fact that, you know, a lot of boards will be very formal in their processes, very structured, very much about Robert's Rules of Order. And there's nothing wrong with Robert's Rules of Order. It exists for good reason, because it tells you have to have an agenda so that when people come to a meeting, they know why they're gathering. It has to have some clarity of timing, and, you know, is it going to start at 2 or is it going to start at 6, and when's it going to end, likely, so that we can all have a bit of sense of timing. And what are the motions or decisions that we have to make? So being clear about that. So those practices are important, and keeping a record of your board matters for all kinds of reasons, and whether some of those are colonial reasons that aren't great, or important reasons because that's how the legal structure works, frankly. You have to keep minutes of your board meetings. If they're official, proper board meetings, you need to keep minutes, because someday you'll probably be audited and you'll have to produce them. So there's practice, and then there's practice. So how do we want to run our meetings? Do we want to be more relaxed about certain things? Could we change how we come together physically? Are there challenges that we're having around the digital space that we need to address that can support different board members, that kind of thing? So what are the practices? The other is obviously board policy, and sometimes board policy will drive practice. We tend to advise organizations to let policy follow practice. So what is the practice you want? And then to solidify that in a policy statement, like codes of conduct, for example. Really important, right? If you draft a code of conduct in isolation, you're going to end up with a code of conduct that may not fit well and then won't be followed. So you need to start with what is the kind of conduct that we think is appropriate for our board members to engage in, like using preferred pronouns, for example. Is that a code of conduct? Is that something as an organization that we want to say is a policy and everyone has to do it? And if you don't want to do it, then you're the one that has to leave, rather than the person whose pronouns may not be respected. So the question for you to think about today is, where do you want to start? What is that starting point for you? Oh, no, go back. Yeah. So then recruiting for diversity. And again, when we say diversity, we're talking about people from different experiences, different backgrounds, different relationships, so that you have a number of lenses that are being applied to that governance role. And so one way to do it is to start, a good way to do it, frankly, is just start with a board matrix. And now I don't know if you can grab the board matrix. There's 2 board matrices that we're going to share with you now in the chat room. One is a more complex one that's an Excel spreadsheet, and then there's this kind of a simplified version if you don't want to get that extreme. But the nice thing about a board matrix is that you start to break down what is it everyone's bringing to the board table right now? What do we have at the board table right now? and where are some gaps? And some of those might be about the demographics of people. So, you know, people with disabilities, Indigenous people, new immigrants, Chinese Canadian, you know, people who speak various languages, demographic relationships, but also it allows you to identify, do we have someone who understands finance as well, an accountant or someone who's been working in that field? Do we have someone who understands some of the governance type issues or legal issues maybe? So if you start with that and let the board complete that as a board together and see the gaps, then you recruit someone with those. So you actually put out postings, and you can use something like Go Volunteer, or your local volunteer center probably has a program like Go Volunteer where you can post a volunteer posting. Charity Village has them, by the way, as well, for free for volunteering. And you can say in that posting, we are looking for someone with legal skills, or we are looking for someone, here are the kind of 3 characteristics of a board member that we'd love to see. And if that comes in the same person, like an accountant who is a new immigrant and Chinese Canadian and speaks Mandarin, there you go. You've got all 3 covered in one fell swoop. But so putting a posting out there that describes that. Oh yes, exactly. The first Indo-Canadian speaker of the BC legislature. So yeah, it's not about his qualifications, though it is kind of impressive to know that, well, it's important to know that we haven't had an Indo-Canadian speaker all this time. And that this is the first time in 2000, almost 2001, that we've had a speaker who's Indo-Canadian. So that's something to be thought about. But yeah, he's the speaker of the legislature because he's an incredible parliamentarian. That's why he's the speaker. Anyway, yeah, don't get me started on those things. But it's important to acknowledge those moments. My mother was the first female mayor of Victoria. It was a big deal. But at the same time, that wasn't why she was mayor, because she was a woman. She was mayor for all kinds of good reasons. So yeah, so anyway, back to the board matrix. So you can use the board matrix to do that and to attract diverse candidates and people with various backgrounds.
We actually can show you here. I'll stop screen sharing and then I can share the file. But what we can do here actually is just quickly show what, what sort of a traditional quote unquote board matrix could look like. Kind of what Allison's been saying is you'll have, your sort of things that you're looking for. So connection to community for demographics, generational perspective, cultural identity, governance experience, boards, committees, etc., skills and expertise. Usually it's an accountant, usually it's a lawyer, maybe an HR person, marketing, IT, areas of influence, government, business, media. Those are the usual ones. And then leadership or thinking style, so strategic, generative, and fiduciary. So these are the things that we generally look for. And this is just fine. We can look for this too, but this might lend us to not having that sort of lens of just looking at someone based on their experience and not what they're checking off the box. So what we can do here is instead just say we're looking for, so it's blank. What is their group or social identification? What is their lived or living experience or leadership experience? And we can go down here and actually just fill these in just based on what we know of this person or what we see on their resume or their application. And this can help us work out how we're going to be recruiting as well and who we end up recruiting in the long run. And I'll share these in a second as well.
Yeah, I shared the more complex one and the simplified one already. So
excellent. Yeah. And then another thing that we can share, but I don't think we have time to dive into today, is also what a position description can look like as well for building that sort of lens of inclusion and potential for diversity. We'll share two. We'll share one that actually is not that inclusive, has a lot of things missing from it, and can deter someone from applying from your organization. I think Allison's sharing those now. And then we have another one would actually build a lot onto that position description and gives the individual who might be coming into this organization the true expectations of what's coming and what to expect. So it could be, again, the kind of building that they're going into, maybe the language expectations that are currently on the board that, they might need to consider what the salary is or what sort of payments they have. What if their board member is babysitting covered, or is it always in the evenings and things like that as well.
Yeah, and when you're doing a position description, the key is to look over it and say, is there anything in this that might deter someone from participating? And again, that's where diversity in the organization may help. Maybe there's staff members from the particular community that you're hoping to recruit from, and they can take a look at it and go, well, actually, you know, because you said it was always going to involve evenings, some parents of small children might not be able to participate, or because it's Friday nights, there might be Jewish people who can't participate because that's a night of family gathering, or Sunday mornings, you know, is a common Christian church moment. Like there's, you know, thinking through some of those questions when you're looking at the job description to say, is, you know, have we assumed people will come to us for meetings? Have we assumed a certain level of digital capacity? A couple of people were commenting in the chat about the digital divide and just how serious that is. So yeah, so that's the key. So we just give an example there of ways you can do that.
Mm-hmm. Oh, sorry, 1 second.
Yeah, the next, yeah, where to recruit. So this is, I mean, AMSSA's obviously got an amazing posting service. Really, one certainly that I've used most of my nonprofit management career. But posting for volunteers on all kinds of different places really is key. Do you want to speak to that now too?
Absolutely. So I think the key to recruitment is also posting where you usually wouldn't have as well. Actually, and I will say AMSSA is one of our examples on the notes in the slide. So absolutely, we usually tell people AMSSA is a great place, reaching out to Mosaic as well. Charity Village, Go Volunteer, the usual places, but absolutely do that there. And by building that position description as we've shared, that can help with places like Charity Village and Go Volunteer to kind of bolster your position descriptions up to the next level. Reaching out to your current volunteer base, that's huge. You just never know what networks they have, what connections they have, their community, and just how far that reach can go as well. And then advertising in different languages, if this is possible for your organization. I think AMSSA probably does a lot of this already, but having that, you know, maybe the 3 languages that you know are pretty dominant within the community that you live within, advertising in those to begin with, and then continuing that as you go forward, reaching out to ethnic communities, community hubs, certain events as well, having flyers out, having, you know, as targeted social media as well could work. Newsletters or professional or business associations, like those sort of newsletters that do go out, reaching out to them and say, hey, we have a couple position descriptions we'd love to see if we can get it into your newsletter and get to your community or your networks as well. And then having information sessions. I think a lot of the trend now for a lot of people is to have those informational sessions, whether it's a phone call or just a sit down session with folks to say, this is what our board is doing right now. This is who we are looking for. And that's general. So we could say we're looking for, you know, fundraising ability or experience, or maybe someone who, you know, has dealt with, you know, keeping a budget for a small organization, things like that. So you can conduct information sessions to make it a little bit more approachable for that person who maybe hasn't been on a board before. And then distributing brochures, maybe when we go back to being in person, maybe that's something that just sits in the front desk area, or maybe that's something that maybe is an insert somewhere with another organization that you can kind of partner with as well. So those would be my sort of things for recruitment as well.
Yeah, and I would just add, just in terms of professional associations, they almost all of them will have, so if you're looking for someone with a social work background or an accounting background, they all have newsletters and associations that you can Google and find, and send the posting off to that group. And most of those organizations have like subsectors, is what the subsections is what they're called, like the legal community, for example. The Canadian Bar Association, they have subsections of groups that focus on, you know, certain kinds of law. So if you want, for example, an employment lawyer to be on your board, it's important to know not all lawyers practice in all areas of law, right? Same with accountants, they specialize in certain things. So finding the Canadian Bar Association subsection on employment law and saying, hey, we're looking for an employment lawyer, and passing it around that way. So that's something to dig into. And I also find the universities are really great because they have alumni lists and things as well, right? People who are out early in their career who might be quite interested in joining a board for the opportunity to gain experience and leadership experience, and sending it out to those colleges and universities as well.
Mm-hmm. And so we always like to talk about possible next steps for the board.
Oh, now you froze.
It could be a diversity inclusion policy. Is it better yet?
No, it's a little jaggy, but there, I think you were saying that there's a diversity inclusion policy on in our resources.
Mm-hmm. Is it better now?
Downloadable resources. Yeah, you're better now. So go.
Wonderful. Go figure, internet. Actually, Van City has a great one that we usually send out to our participants. So we can send that to you on the chat. I'll just stop screen sharing in a bit, and then I'll send it on the chat there. But there's a great one you can build off of and put it on your website, or include it in your position descriptions, or when you are recruiting for a board, and maybe share it on your social media once it's done as well, to have that ready for when you do start recruitment again, or just having it so that volunteers know or staff know that this is an approachable, this is organization, this is the board that is aware of creating inclusion and is passionate about it and ready to take on the next step. So creating that policy. And then removing barriers to participation. So knowing maybe your current board members, what barriers are they experiencing that maybe they haven't voiced yet? What can we change currently on our board to make it possible for participation to be enhanced? So maybe that's moving our meetings to a different time, putting a little bit in the budget for paying for a babysitter, making a description of the space and the individuals on the board and where we convene to attract new members. And then mentorship for new members. This is something I think that people are really starting to consider too, is having a sort of a buddy system on the board for this new person to come on board, understand what's going on, get up to speed, and also share what their needs are in order to participate fully. And the last note here we'll say is external help. Definitely keep this learning and this this journey going with assessments and audits. You can get accessibility audits, you can get equity and inclusion audits as well done. There's great consultants out there. One that we work with quite a bit is Cecily Bell-Blaine Consulting. They do great work that you can kind of build onto your organization and get them to train maybe your whole staff or your whole board, and just continuing that training as well and keeping that going. And then thinking about possible next steps for you as well. So staying mindful in interactions. We talked about that unconscious bias. Pausing when you think of a bias coming, when you see that bias coming, pausing, addressing it and questioning it. Exposure to counter narratives, learning, for example, learning about Indigenous leaders in government. Maybe saying, I don't want to go learn about their histories, or there's an aspect of this community that I do serve. Maybe it's youth. I'm going to think about how we can, what are youth worried about right now? What's maybe the digital divide that we should be assessing right now as well? So exposure to counter narratives and understanding, a better understanding of who you are serving. And then allyship, understanding what allyship means. We won't have much time to delve into that too much right now, but basically being there for an individual without judgment and fully, and being an ally means stepping back when that you can give them space to speak for themselves, or being there to stand up with them when maybe they're experiencing a barrier or discrimination or something like that. So being there when their safety is threatened, but then stepping back and giving them space to truly be and lead. And then
we had a great,
go ahead, Alison.
I can't remember now if you were the one who did it, but we had a great situation at Vantage Point once. We were talking about a client maybe who had done something, we responded in a kind of what I would describe as a racist way to somebody. And so we had a discussion about what to do about it. And the staff member who had engaged with them was a person of color. And the question was whether I, as the executive director, should say something. And somebody, I think it was you, Nav, asked the question, would that be empowering or disempowering for Allison to step in and do something, right? And so asking that question as an ally is so important, to say, I want to support you, but would my supporting you take away your sense of power and your control over the situation, or would it empower you and empower the situation and make it different? So as allies, if I'm a straight person and I'm trying to support queer people, or if I'm a white person trying to support people of color, or a non-Indigenous person, etc., it's like, is my involvement empowering or disempowering?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, absolutely. That's a great example. And yeah, I think it was me.
I think it was you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Shows you how diverse our group is. I can't remember. Anyway.
But yeah, and then considering your next step personally, I would say the journey may be on your board as well, but it's also the personal to continue this as well, and think about where you can keep going with this work. And then I think we can move on to questions as well as this survey.
Yeah, I'm going to just do a little plug before we open up for questions, but for the survey that we have here, and I'll put it in the chat room too, but it's the No Immunity survey. So if you're with an organization, we're collecting all the feedback on the impact of COVID on not-for-profits, but our evaluation survey is also important. And while people are putting up their questions, I'll make sure both are in the chat line.
Excellent. So I'll stop screen sharing so I can share the Van City policy as well. But any questions that anybody has, please let us know in the chat or unmute yourself.
Thank you for this session. I just wanted to say, as a person of color, it doesn't matter which board you are in. There's always, you still feel oppressed. You still have to follow the colonial system. So, it seems like now our society is going into using the word equity and equality and inclusion. It's just like a trend. And every time I go, I feel like I'm just like butting my head against all these walls, because at the end of the day, I always wind up saying is, we all have to learn what it means to be anti-racist. If we don't get there by ourselves and know what that is, we're not going to go anywhere. Our systems are not going to change. We can do all the talking we want, but the system is there, right? We have all these Indigenous logos, every agency. This is just like a trend. It's like a fashion statement. Black Lives Matter, yay, let's start. You even see the ads with Black folks now, right? Everything is there. Just it's a trend.
Well, I think I might disagree a little bit, Shabina, because there's been people working on these issues for hundreds and hundreds of years, right? So the fact that certain people in positions of power are now using the language and understanding it, I think we have to challenge that. Is it superficial? Is it only performative as the language uses? Or is it meaningful? And I think with boards, one of the things is there's a lot of assumption about how a board has to run that I think is very colonial, and a board could be run in a variety of ways that are more equitable and inclusive. So there's also some choice there, but ultimately it is part of the Canadian legal system, the structure, right? So ultimately it's going to be colonial until we change everything about, as you say, about it. But yes, it's a trend. It's also a window. Having worked in women's equality all my life, the Me Too movement, part of me was like, oh boy, here, it's this thing now. But at the same time, I'm like, yeah, but it's what I've been fighting for 20 years. So shouldn't I be excited? So it's this balance, right? Of this is a window that we could maybe push the agenda a little farther.
And I would say too, it's not a bad idea to question. So for example, if your organization in June put up a Black image on Instagram and said Black Lives Matter, what have you done next? Are you still understanding what the history is? Do you know what systems are still in play that oppress Black individuals? What's going on in Canada? So it's asking yourself and your organization, your board, what are we doing next? What are we talking about next? And then also for, territorial acknowledgements, I agree, like you see them in every signature and every event and things, and I think that's wonderful. But why are you doing it? Are you doing it because it's boilerplate? Or are you doing it because you truly understand the history of these territories and the lands that you are living on, and you're doing it because you truly are understanding and you want this awareness to be shared? So that's what I would say too. So I think, yes, in some ways, definitely trendy. But I think if the intent is there to continue this work and go, like Allison's saying, it's a window to continue to move that agenda even further, to move this work and this understanding further, I think eventually it won't be a trend. That's my hope anyway.
But I agree, we don't talk enough about racism and anti-racism in these workshops. That's pretty important.
Yeah, but I think yeah, everything boils down to what does it mean to be anti-racist. We talk about racism and what does it mean to be anti-racist, right? We don't talk about that.
Yeah, it's not enough to say I'm not racist, but what are you doing to be anti-racist?
Yeah.
So are you, calling down someone when they make that funny joke? Or are you, addressing people when they don't know the full history, or they make excuses and things like that as well? So are you stopping it as well as being anti-racist?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, and I see there was a.
Yay.
Yeah, perfect.
Coming. I also put on the website nativeland.ca, which is a great website for everyone. So the territorial acknowledgement piece of being superficial, part of it is also about finding out what lands we are on and what were the nations that were here before the Canadian settlement happened. And Native Land's a great website to go to before you're doing anything, to say, well, actually my land, the land I'm on, for example, was part of the Stolo Nation on the Fraser River. And the Stolo people and their traditions is something that I'm exploring on my own, right? Because that's the land I'm living on right now.
You know what really kills me is like the doctrine of discovery. I know it's a very heavy, you know what I'm saying, right? The doctrine of discovery, like when we're talking about Indigenous folks, it really sucks. It's just like our system, our colonial government has not denounced that.
Yeah.
And yet we are trying to reconcile. How do we reconcile if that damn thing is still there?
Exactly.
Yeah. For those who don't know, the doctrine of discovery was the Europeans basically divided up the globe back in, I think it was the 1700s or 1600s, maybe even earlier, under the Pope and various others who decided that, if you discover the land, you get it's yours. And they went around and carved up the globe as if somehow it belonged to them.
And if you don't have Christian faith, so you can take it away from them. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. I'd also challenge folks to actually look at a globe and see how the countries are actually lined out, because that's actually very colonial as well. The way that countries look bigger than they actually are that's on purpose.
Yeah, the UK is teeny. It really is. It's minuscule.
Yeah, it's super small.
So yeah, we've lots of conversation. We only have 4 minutes left, so feel free to reach out to Vantage Point if you have more questions about this or thoughts or feedback. Nav and I are both available to respond to queries and questions. And we'll leave it back to you, Katie.
Thank you. So thank you so much to Nav and Allison. Really great to have the discussion, particularly looking at these many of us in the sector, most of us in the sector are already knee deep or neck deep in talking about these issues, like we talked about at the beginning, but really looking at it in terms of how do we reflect it from the senior governance level of our organizations. I think all too often we look at creating a diverse workforce, but we don't look at actually the leadership and the governing of our organization. So really, really appreciate your insights today on that. So upcoming lecture topics, lectures 5 and 6 we have coming up in February. We're doing a 2-part series on critical LGBTQ and newcomer settlement issues. First one will look at kind of the more larger, broad challenges and different supports out there for LGBTQ newcomers. And the second one will be focusing in more on supporting trans newcomers and looking at the real distinct settlement journey for trans newcomers. So that's going to be in February, and then we'll have a couple more coming up as well. So really enjoying doing these lecture series with you. So there will be an evaluation form. We really need the information in the evaluation form. So we look forward to hearing back from you on that. Again, big thank you to IRCC for funding this activity today. And thank you so much for attending. 4 o'clock on the nose. I can hear my 3-year-old downstairs screaming mommy. So I think it's time for me to go. So thank you everybody for being here.